what we now call identity politics. Elsewhere, I've suggested that identity politics had its origins in the Combahee River Collective's uptake of Maoism's emphasis on subjective work. A Black socialist feminist grouping, the CRC, had produced its manifesto in 1977 at a time when the universalist prospects for Black Marxism were thought to be enhanced by Asian historical precedent. Now looking back, 1977 was already a moment of Asian revolutionary thermidor, the beginning of our present time, when Afro-Asianism looks to us like just a weak analogy. In the 60s conjuncture of revolutionary third worldisms, however, Afro-Asianism was an aspirational Marxist-Leninist strategy. Solidarity meant not just sympathetic allyship with others, but an interlinked means of working toward revolution at home. But how? We are distant enough from that period when a good number of American leftists thought that global capitalism was in crisis and that an American revolution was imminent, not to see that perspective as somehow deeply unreal. Max Albaum's Revolution in the Air judges it to have suffered from a miniaturized Leninism. And the judgment was that in the final analysis, commitment to putting politics in command meant that the NCM was always going to be a revolution conducted in the air, a voluntarist overreach. With the waning of belief in cultural revolution, the behaviors, actions, and thoughts of that moment look increasingly like cultural appropriation. And so try as we might to get inside the heads of militants who had once wanted to be Black like Mao, it's hard not to see them as some kind of well-meaning Orientalist. Once in a while, we get a jarring reminder that that history, the history of Marxism in the United States, actually existed, not just as some fantasy or rhetoric of counterinsurgency, but we get that jarring reminder, for example, even in October when Nancy Pelosi tells ceasefire protesters to go back to China where your headquarters are. So what would it mean, though, to take US Afro-Asianism seriously as a Marxist political theory and practice? There are perils and difficulties on many sides. And I do want to emphasize, though, before I get into this, to mention the extraordinary work of some younger scholars, Calvin Chung Miao, Cindy Gao, Eddie Bonilla, who are all now working to recover that history, and that I'm just not alone in this corner. Of course, there are others whose shoulders I stand on, and I'm happy to talk about these precedents in the Q&A. But to be telegraphic, some perils and difficulties. One, there's an institutional peril to owning up to the origins of US ethnic studies and Marxism, and not narrating it as a fight club between non-Marxist notions of race and class, a perpetual fight club, right? Two, viewing US Afro-Asianism from the perspective of critical theory, there's a different kind of blockage that's internal to Marxist theory. And from this angle of vision, there's an antinomy between Marxist theoretical, there's an antinomy between where Marxist theoretical renewal was understood to be happening in the 60s and orthodox Marxism, by which is meant party Marxisms. Maoism was a party Marxism. So to try to clear some of that blockage, during the Cultural Revolutionary period in China, that is 1966 to 1976, it was customary for Mao to present himself as the true descendant of Lenin and Stalin. In the US in the same period, though, it was more customary for American Maoists to tout the Chinese Revolution for having gone beyond the Soviet revolutionary tradition altogether. And this meant that Mao was sometimes said not just to be Stalin's equal as an interpreter of Lenin, but indeed to be Lenin's equal as an interpreter of Marx. And under such circumstances, the line between thinking that Maoism represented a departure from a fundamentally Eurocentric Marxism and thinking that Maoism represented a renewal of Marxism on a more truly global scale was in fact a blurry one. Thus, for various reasons, after the closing of the 60s conjuncture, it's been hard to see how US Third Worldism was any kind of a return to Marx. And the fact is, Marx himself was less often studied by the new communists, for whom Mao, Che, Cabral, and Fanon were de rigueur. Now, two exceptions in this milieu were James and Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit and Harry Chang in San Francisco. who exerted an outsized influence on Black and Third Worldist revolutionary activists. The Boggses and Chang were Marxist dialecticians who came at Marxism with a background in Hegel and were very interested in the philosophical Marx. They were deeply interested in Marx's critique of political economy and capital, and they approached the question of race and racism in the US through capital's categories and methods. Their respective uses of capital to conceptualize race and racism were not purely theoretical exercises. They were written in direct address to left activists to try to intervene in strategic debates concerning the relationship between race and class happening then within the left. Whereas many NCM activists would evoke the fact of anti-imperialist movements in Asia, especially China and Vietnam, to herald the real potentiality of a coming third world or Black-led revolution in the US, the Wind in the East left its historical trace on the Boggses and Chang's writings in very complicated, sometimes cautionary ways, leading, for example, to pessimistic conclusions about the fundamentally petit bourgeois consciousness of Asian Americans, scathing criticisms of the opportunistic content of culturalist forms of Black power, and even the inherent racism of all racial thinking that indicted both exclusionary and nationalist tendencies within the left. Now, beyond this commonality, the Boggses and Chang's thinking were quite different. And the book version of this paper sketches out the Boggses and Chang's different uses of Marx to ground a theory of race and racism in political economic history, and their different uses of Mao to boost the new communist idea of a Black-led revolution against US capitalism. Given time constraints, I will have to devote most of my attention today to the Boggses and conclude with a few scattered remarks about Chang. So now to the Boggs. As partners and activists, the Boggses were regarded in movement circles very much as one unit. According to the biographer Stephen Ward, much of James Boggs's publications were the product of co-thinking with his wife, Grace Lee Boggs, and we would be justified in thinking of the writing that appears solely under his name as also significantly shown her influence, perhaps even the American Revolution, his most famous work published in 1963. For today, though, I want to focus on two essays from the period of the late 60s by James Boggs that explicitly acknowledge Grace as a co-author. And these essays are collected in Racism and the Class Struggle, but they were published earlier as articles in periodicals, and one is called The City is the Black Man's Land from 1965, and the other is Uprooting Racism and Racists in the United States, 1969. These essays, I think, represent some of the most developed ideas to have come of the new communism staging of an encounter between Marx and Mao, here applied to the advancement of what the Boggses call a scientific concept of Black power that could potentially be a replacement for the Trotskyist variant of workers' power, which is the background from which they came. Now, I'm going to assume that most of us today, owing to the important work of Cedric Johnson and Jason Smith, and I apologize if that's a wrong assumption, I'm happy to answer more, are more likely to see the American Revolution as an inspired interpretation of Marxist capital than to agree with C.L.R. James's then judgment that Boggs had fundamentally departed the Marxist tradition when he proposed that Black surplus populations were the new revolutionary force in lieu of the working class. And I'll therefore not spend time arguing that case. Instead, I'll just move directly to arguing for seeing the city as the Black man's land as the American Revolution's programmatic sequel and theoretical expansion. The City is the Black Man's Land presents Black power as the revolutionary answer to an automation process that has been rendering labor more and more socially unnecessary in the United States, and that requires that, quote, another form of socially necessary activity, they say, be put in its place. Where the American Revolution had focused on Black unemployment, The City is the Black Man's Land describes the consequent redirection of African Americans into jobs in education, social and public service, teaching, hospital, sanitation, transportation, public health, recreation, and social welfare, areas which are, they say, the responsibility of city government, and as it happens, socially the most necessary in the cybercultural era. These are their words. Now, I take their term socially necessary activity to be a deliberate echo of Marx's concept of socially necessary labor time, or SNLT, And I thus interpret them to be saying, given the decreasing importance of SNLT, that is, living under the social domination of abstract labor, we should instead reorient ourselves to non-value producing activity, what we today maybe call social reproductive labor. Importantly, it's activity we're already doing. And when that work is paid, a good deal of it is occurring within the where of the public sector. So while Black people may have become permanent outsiders to the factory, they are already inside city government. Putting politics in command thus accommodates a range of seemingly opposed forms for them. It can mean armed struggle or running for elected office, a seizure of the means of force, or a reform of already existing institutions. And I think the ambiguity is deliberate. It accommodates a range of possible strategies. What is determinate is that the city for them is the relevant scale or unit. And they write, either the city will keep devolving into a breeding place of seemingly senseless violence policed by a growing occupation army, or it becomes a place with the idea of people faring well off the fruits of advanced technology and the labors of past generations without the necessity to work for a living is as normal as the idea of organized labor has become. To achieve this second, obviously more desirable outcome, Black militants must be prepared to hold power, despite the likelihood of constant hostile attack from the national power structure, they say. And this means thinking of the present day deindustrializing city as a base. We would not be wrong to hear in their use of the term base an evocation of Mao's guerrilla warfare strategy and its potential extension to urban politics. But for this geographical analogy between American city and Chinese country to not seem like a really weird stretch, we need to turn to the broader question of the race-nation analogy that was first posited by the CPUSA in the 1920s. The late New Left is generally understood to have revived the race-nation analogy first posited in the CP's Black Nation thesis, or BNT, of the 1920s. Extending Stalin's criteria for a nation to race, the BNT represented the CP's adoption of the struggle against Black oppression in the US as a central plank in an overall program of Black and white unite and fight. In the Boggses, the city is the Black man's land, the race-nation analogy appears first as a comparison between Black American unemployment and colonial underdevelopment. Quote, like the colored peoples of the underdeveloped, i.e. super-exploited countries, the Boggses write, Afro-Americans have been kept in a state of underemployment, doing tasks which are already technologically outmoded, end quote. However, they go on to note, while 75 to 80% of the population in China and Vietnam lives in the countryside, a comparable portion of Afro-Americans live in the city side. So Black American city and Asian countryside form not so much an analogy, but a dialectical pair. Socially necessary activity means opposite things in an underdeveloped country versus an advanced country. In the first case, educational preparation for entry into the industrial workforce versus educational preparation for something else. I read the Boggses to be saying, though they don't use this term, in Asia, the majority are yet to be really subsumed by the capitalist relations of production, while the US is confronting at the same time the limit of real subsumption. So the self-determination struggles of Black Americans and Asian masses are thus not being compared but contrasted as two types of relative surplus populations, stagnant and latent. And as two types of relative surplus populations, Black Americans and Asian masses, furthermore, are being dynamically related. They exist in a social relation through the logic of capital accumulation, which proceeds on a global scale. So thus, to the extent that the Viet Cong and Black Power are to be grasped as part of the same worldwide social revolution against the same enemy, and this is italicized, that enemy is not just the US as an oppressor imperialist nation, but US capitalists, not just US capitalists, but capital as a whole. So as a continuation of the American Revolution's rereading of Marx's Capital, the city is the Black man's land, in other words, moves us from chapter 25, or the climax of Capital, part 7, on the general law of capital accumulation, that forms one ending of the volume 1 of Capital, to the chapters 26 through 33 that comprise part 8 of Capital, which returned to the historical scene of primitive accumulation in early modern Europe, and which formed the second ending of capital. The violent separation of people from land in Vietnam is integrally connected to the process of racialized deindustrialization within the US. And it's on this theoretical basis, drawing upon Marxist value theory, that the Boggses are able to offer a political vision for Afro-Asian solidarity. What comes after the revolution? A post-work Black commune stretching from Vietnam and China to Detroit. Kind of amazing. Now, the Boggs are certainly aware that they are proposing a revolutionary definition of Black that has to run up against common sense epidermal schemas. Black, they lay out in a footnote, is a, quote, political designation to refer not only to Afro-Americans, but to people of color who are engaged in revolutionary struggle in the United States and all over the world. It should not be taken to mean the domination of Afro-Americans or the exclusion of other people of color from Black revolutionary organization, end quote. And so in a later essay, Uprooting Racism and Racists in the United States, published in 1969, they set out to develop a political economy of race that accounts for the persistence of racism after slavery. And in this essay, they propose that African Americans and immigrants of color have shared a common confinement to, quote, a scavenger economic role that serves to amortize losses on obsolete machinery. Importantly, this essay, Uprooting Racism and Racists in the United States, is the only essay by the Boggses to make explicit mention of Asian exclusionism in the United States. The American Revolution had posited a structural immigrant Black antagonism with the statement that every immigrant who walked off the gangplank to make his way in the land of opportunity was climbing onto the Negroes' backs. But by the time of Uprooting Racism and Racists in the US, assignation to a scavenger role was a condition seen to be shared by Blacks and other colored peoples. This is a quote, Blacks and other colored peoples, such as Chinese and Japanese on the West Coast and Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, end quote. So among the innovations of the scavenger role, upon the American Revolution's discussion of Black outsiders, was the expansion of their idea of a racialized industrial reserve army of labor to a racialized reserve army of production and consumption, the latter involved in what they call the recycling of used factories, homes, schools, church, stores, etc., the preservation of existing capital in the face of continually advancing technology. It's something that I would describe as a theory of a racial fix, to echo Harvey's geographical term for thinking about accumulation by dispossession. In sum, as theorists of Black and Third World liberation, the Boggses were unusual in the way they sought to develop a Marxist political economy of race, returning to Marxist categories. Over the course of the 60s, as the question of US imperialism in Vietnam increasingly came to be fused with the question of Black power, the Boggses were able to lean on the concept of relative surplus populations to theorize the linked fates of US peoples of color and Asian peasant masses. In the American Revolution, they had indicated that Black unemployment was a harbinger of general American unemployment to come. I'm doing that. The subsequent expansion of their sense of Blackness to include US colored people and third world populations of the world, now therefore comprising a literary planetary majority, was in some ways just further empirical substantiation of their originary universalists. I was leaning on the keyboard.
Oh, you just don't need this. You don't need this.
I was leaning on the keyboard. I'll do that sentence again. I did that. I messed up. No, I know not to do that now. In this essay, they proposed that African Americans and immigrants of color, no, that's not what I said, sorry. Basically, in the American Revolution, they had indicated that Black unemployment was a harbinger of general American unemployment to come. The subsequent expansion of their sense of Blackness to include US colored people and third world populations of the world, now therefore comprising a literary planetary majority, was in some ways to just further empirically substantiate their originary universalist conceptualization of Black particularity. I hope that makes sense. So also, theirs was perhaps the most innovative 60s reimagining of the Black nation thesis, redrawing what the BNT had pictured as a continuous Black belt in the agricultural South to a pointillism of deindustrializing cities in the North. drawing inspiration from Mao's guerrilla warfare strategy, which had defined guerrilla warfare as a military operation that has no rear, a base as something completely surrounded by enemy territory, and a cadre as morphologically indistinguishable from a peasant. The Boggses saw the Black nation as something to be created through revolutionary action, not something ontologically already there. Okay, so in the end, the power of their fusion of Marxian concepts and Chinese example was perhaps overly pinned to the historical bet that the crisis of profitability that then everywhere in evidence was also the terminal crisis of capital. And thus, as the 70s wore on, that fusion reversed itself into a culturalist interpretation of Mao that during the peak of the Cultural Revolution, they had once inveighed against, and that made their original dialectical approach to race and nation increasingly hard to distinguish from a superficial indulgence in analogism. In a new introduction to the 2009 edition of the American Revolution, which was 15 years after James Boggs' death, Grace Lee Boggs attributes her husband's calm response to CLR James's repudiation as rooted in her husband's dialectical thinking that one inevitably divides into two. The use of this phrase accords a Maoist interpretation to the form of their break with James, CLR James, without going so far as to narrate that movement as a passage from Trotskyism to Maoism. In the course of a movement, she writes, if unity is given priority, the movement comes to an end. Now, the 2009 introduction does not mention Mao by name anywhere, but it does mention Confucius. Weird. Okay, now how do I actually advance this thing?
Does the keyboard text?
No, I think I killed it.
Oh, here, you can use the mouse.
Oh, thank you. Uh-oh. Is that right? No, that's wrong. How do I go back? Weird. Oh, no, that's correct. Okay. All right. The 2009 introduction does not actually mention Mao anywhere by name, but it does mention Confucius. So she writes, even though Jimmy spoke what he called Alabamese, scholars called it Black English, and had never studied Chinese philosophy, he shared Confucius's view that if language is not correct, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence, there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. Grace suggests that a Black Chinese analogy was really James Boggs' own inspiration. She quotes him as having once said, when speaking for the first time before a New York audience, that they should be, quote, willing to struggle with his Alabamese because one day they would have to struggle to understand a billion Chinese. They're supposed to be Jimmy Boggs' words, right? Now, readers of this 2009 introduction to the American Revolution would not be faulted for sensing a retroactive signification of the Boggs' joint political evolution in the interests of Grace's own late developing embrace of an Asian American identity, which kind of happened in the 1990s. But a signification with merely cultural content. But even if 2009 was no longer an opportune moment to name check Mao, there's no way to fully expunge a Maoist framing of the political autobiography of that Asian American identity and the framing of that passage of their political development as one divides into two, right? Which is a Mao quote, a very famous Maoist slogan from the 60s. Okay, so now in the shortage of time, I'm going to pivot. The imbrication of Asian American identity and Marxism presents another puzzle in the figure of Harry Chang. And I should say in advance that my following remarks on Chang are written in a speculative mode, which I hope will be an invitation to our thinking together and not too off-putting because so elliptical, which could be the case. Harry Chang was no self-identified Maoist. And indeed, he spent much of his time in the 60s and 70s trying to counteract the pastiche education of Marxism he thought to be unfortunately endemic to fetishists of the Little Red Book. The most consequential writing he published was Critique of the Black Nation Thesis, a pamphlet that appeared in 1975 under the group author name of the Racism Research Project, though it was commonly known in activist circles that most of that writing in it was Chang's. What has made that publication of lasting interest has been more owing to the fact that a number of the members of the Racism Research Project were important activists and or went on to produce important intellectual work, then that its ideas had been picked up. The members included Tatsumi, an iconic figure of the San Francisco IWK, her then partner Neil Gotanda and brother of the playwright Philip Kahn Gotanda, who became a founding figure in Asian American critical race theory, Linda Burnham, Bob Wing, and Bruce Okenya, who became key founders of the Line of March, some of whom are still active in today's progressive scene and are active in the anti-MAGA movement now. Critique of the Black Nation thesis held the renewed popularity of the BNT to signal not just lazy thinking, but something more pernicious, a theoretical justification for the unsavory state of the racially divided organizational workings of the New Left. Noting that the danger of forming a practical response to racism that simultaneously took for granted racism's theoretical premises, the pamphlet found a similarity between the inadequacies of contemporary anti-racisms and non-revolutionary critiques of capitalism in Marxist time. Following a Marxist method of critique of political economy and capital, a more properly Marxist social analysis applied to the race question would require beginning, okay, let's try this, no, beginning, no, with the analysis, a properly Marxist social analysis applied to the racial question would require beginning with the analysis of the dialectic of racial categories, then proceed to the investigation of the real relations which produce this form of thought. In this way, racial categories will be seen as the ideological reflection of those real relations, which we now call ex post facto race relations. Despite going so far as to declare that all racial categories are inherently racist categories, in that they originate as a form of thought and self-description of a slave-holding society, the pamphlet nevertheless arrives at the judgment that contemporary Black nationalism in the 60s was a promising, even an incomplete, response to racism. Can't do this very well. No. For Marxists, the question is not whether Black nationalism has the right to exist or not, nor whether it is in itself progressive or reactionary. The real question is how Black nationalism as a particular response may contribute or detract at a specific time and in a specific context vis-a-vis the general resolution of racism. And given this and the broader movement to express the urgency of an all-out assault on racism and to mobilize the people to that end, Black nationalism has been an asset. How does this even make sense? Opposite to those who set out to determine the categorical priority of race versus class within a strategic context, the pamphlet's theoretical approach to racism in terms of the value form suggests that following from that, there is no strategic prescription on the validity of race-based organizing. But what was that theory of racism? Tersely, the pamphlet defined racism as, quote, the unity of race relations and racial categories. It's an intriguing and obscure phrasing that has failed to garner much notice beyond Chang's circle. And in large part, this is because the properly Marxist analysis of racism that the pamphlet touted as the alternative to the BNT metaphysics was not actually undertaken in any sustained way, here or elsewhere in Chang's writing. So in order to recapitulate his argument, a certain amount of interpretive reconstruction, suturing together different pieces of his writing is required. Chang's whole writing corpus exists in the form of multiple fragmentary, slightly varying drafts of unpublished typescript. In 1986, two of his former students, Paul Lim and Eric Montague, edited and assembled some of them into a single publication in two parts entitled, quote, Toward a Marxist Analysis of Racism, Without the benefit of the rest of his unpublished corpus, however, the published piece is honestly quite hard to understand. However, there are some inspired ideas presented there, chiefly that, quote, racial formation is analogous to money formation. And this idea is now just beginning to be picked up. I noticed that Lucas Eggers, in a recent issue of Race and Capital and Historical Materialism, is calling out Harry Chang now. Are now just beginning to be picked up in the context of today's renewed interest in real abstraction and capital fetishism for conceptualizing race and racism. For our more limited purposes today, I just want to call our attention to the passage in the 1986 publication where Chang writes, I have an apple, so my mouse is totally different. I'm like pathetic. Okay. Racial categories are a social particularization. They are, just to explain, this is from that 1986 one publication that appears under Harry Chang's name, right? Which is in a review of political economics, a radical economics and politics. Okay, so this is the quote. Racial categories are social particularization. They are primarily intrasocial, societal, not intersocietal. As the Chinese would put it, racial categories represent a case of one becoming two. There it is again, rather than two becoming one. As Hegel would put it, racial categories are inner distinctions and not outer distinctions. Further down, he writes, to put it in the language of unity of opposites, whiteness and blackness are coterminous social determinations. White because someone else is determined by it to be black, and black because someone else is determined by it to be white. According to Bob Wing, who was close to Chang, Chang was no Maoist. So what is one becoming two doing here? Now we know from the published writing that Chang sought to develop a method of critique of racism after the manner of Marx's method of critique of political economy. This meant logically beginning from the racial categories whose validity were the product of a prior historical process, right? His unpublished manuscripts give us some clues as to the motivation. No. Okay. This also shows some undialectical ways of raising some questions. In the case of money versus commodity dialectic, vulgar political economy posits the two as separate premises, then asks how money affects or interacts with commodity circulation. Similarly, the run-of-the-mill pseudo-Marxist question about racism asks, how does racism divide the working class? All these are ways by which a produced separation or independence is made into a premise. Then a functional scenario is weaved out of it. By contrast, Marx asks not merely how capitalists exploit workers, but more crucially, how is the separation historically produced? Primitive accumulation. So this is in one of his unpublished manuscripts, which so much better explains the condensed version of this argument that appears in the published version. Okay. So, and I can't get into the whole weeds of this, so I'm just going to try to wrap up to extract some points. It's sorely under-demoed because of shortage of time. But basically, my takeaways are Chang's desire to write a Marxist analysis of racism was no theoreticist exercise. It was located within the same US Maoist context that split SDS, involving fights over the adequacy of the line black and white unite and fight. Whereas Noel Ignatin and Theodore Allen famously criticized that slogan for harboring a white blind spot, which has now evolved into a discourse of white privilege and needing to examine it, Chang was interested, alternatively, in historicizing the division between black and white labor to a historical system of differential proletarianization within a single mode of production. Now, to understand to understand racial formation as an aspect of class formation, that's the phrasing he uses, he sometimes would say racial formation might be seen as an example of one becoming two. Chang's return to Marx, I read as spurred by the movement impact of Mao's lessons on what was or was not dialectical. Those lessons were one becomes two, dialectical, two becoming one, not dialectical. One becoming two, ceaseless. Unity of opposites, temporary. There is no such thing as negation of the negation. Even as Chang tried to adopt Marx's method and urged others to do so, Mao's phrases lingered on as a shorthand for the practice of a dialectical method in a potentially revolutionary conjuncture. And the result was the beginnings of a highly unusual value-form Marxist explanation of why race within the capitalist mode of production can take on a life of its own, and that racism may sometimes have to be fought with Black nationalism. The end.
Thank you so much, Colleen.
Sorry for the incompetence.
That's great. We try to take graduate student questions first, and then move to faculty. But one thing that maybe I'd like to try that we suggest we do, because there was a lot of incredible information here, is to maybe just take a couple of minutes, turn to someone next to you, and say a couple of things. What do you think you learned from this, and what are some questions that you have coming out of this presentation? And then we can kind of come back for questions in a couple minutes. Okay, we're gonna come back. Cool. So Colleen and I were just chatting, and we thought that maybe what we could just start with is, Colleen, I want to ask you before we open up for questions, if you could just help us situate some basic theoretical touch points that not everybody in the room may be familiar with. So just, what is Maoism? What was Maoism in the 60s New Left? Why do the Boggs matter? I guess, like, if you could just place us in the context of maybe I guess, like, the broad question would just be, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the book, but also why return to these debates now, and if you could just like help situate contextually some of this stuff.
Okay. Sorry. Hold on. The why now thing.
Why now? And
Sorry.
maybe just tell us about the book.
Okay. So first of all, Maoism is the object of my theorization, so I cannot give you a definition of it. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. It's like, there's the anti-war, and I take them all seriously because I've become more and more of a Hegelian. So like, they're all connected. And so, yeah, there's Andy Warhol, there's ready-mades, there's like, there's things happening in like commodity culture, but then there's also Marxist-Leninism. And then, so like, people are just unable to write. And yet it's this thing that like people stop being able to see after 1979 for what it was, because China invades Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge is like a disaster. The whole idea of the articulation of Cultural Revolution, Maoism as the leading edge for a social transformation of society everywhere comes to an end, and it's like incredible anti-communism also, kicks in with that, right? So it's super complicated. So I think it's like, but I still think it's part of our present. It's still like, I see post-Marxism and cultural studies and the ways in which ethnic studies has tried to preserve the memory of the 60s insofar as it had its genesis out of this kind of insurrectionist moment in the 60s as a way of preserving the memory of its genesis, the historical conditions of its birth, but trying to create a safe space for that, which has meant accommodations of various kinds, right? We could call it March Through the Institutions, we could call it Rainbow Coalition, we could call it like Hope in the Electoral Turn, Jesse Jackson, all that stuff. And what's so amazing though, is that it's taken a lot of time, I think, for us to be more and more in a different moment away from that but maybe also because things have gotten so bad too, that there's a renewal of Marxism, there's a renewal of a sense that there has to be an alternative, there's a renewal of a sense of the utter, death drive. Robin Kelly, has been talking about this, and Peter Lemmo at the recent Howard Zinn festival, like this death drive of capitalism and imperialism right now that, makes there a great desire to recover this organizational memory, a memory of a moment when people are actually fighting and really believing and trying to change things. So I think that that's why there's like a whole energy of younger scholars who are coming back and like
Shrewsbury, Stelly writing this amazing book, Black Scare, Red Scare, like an actual recovery of the intersection between Marxism and revolutionary nationalisms. Let's put it, anti-colonial revolutionary nationalisms that actually have an affirmative criticism of imperialism and capitalism. So that's the why, maybe. But it's been like something gestating for a long time, because I feel like I came of age in a period where I thought cultural studies would like change the world. And I don't mean to say that in such a disappointed tone, but I guess I did. But just because things suck, right? So, but I think the reason why I really thought that in the 1980s was that I was in that moment of like, oh, Rainbow Coalition, I was in college in the 80s, Rainbow Coalition, and in fact, that was the moment of like, the new communist movement marching through the institutions. They were running the NGOs. They were like trying to, get the first Black president elected. They were, but in a kind of like progressive way that had like a kind of memory of carrying forward the 60s, right? So it's like a very complicated time. Yeah, so my own training is in this, like going to English, doing cultural work. I don't know, but I didn't really answer Maoism. So then, yeah, it's like, well, what was Maoism? What is Maoism?
So maybe you could just talk about historically the split with the USSR.
Oh, the Boggs thing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so, well, so wait, how much of that's gonna be a long word. Sorry. Yeah. Which part? You mean the Boggs, like the Boggs split, or like the Sino-Soviet split?
Oh, yeah. Just like,
do people really want that?
Do people know that?
Do people know this stuff? Like US-China history, or yeah. So basically, maybe the thing that seems I should say is that the Boggs are super interesting because, first of all, I mean, like Grace Lee Boggs was like the first Chinese woman, Chinese American to actually get a PhD in philosophy in Brandeis, and she wrote her thesis on Hegel and translated the Marxist economic and philosophic manuscripts before it existed in English for Black workers to read, Black auto workers in Detroit to read. She was friends with C.L.R. James, and C.L.R. James and Rana Dunayevskaya, of whom your colleague Kevin Anderson here is a great expert, formed this thing called the Johnson-Forrest tendency, and she married this James Boggs, who was a sharecropper from the South, who was an auto worker. They were part of this third layer school where they studied Marxism. They were part of this dissident Trotskyist tendency. Now I'm rambling. And they went through various phases where they collaborated together. And what happens basically, where my story begins, is so they go through these phases of existing within a dissident Trotskyist movement in the US. That C.L.R. James is kind of participant in, even though he's British and he spent some time in the US before he's then like deported and exiled. But then, and they're all close collaborators, but then what happens is James Boggs writes The American Revolution, and where he makes this argument that basically the white working class is so racist, and this is part of automation and an automation theory, which there's a structural reason for all of this, where Blacks are always the last hired, first fired. There's an endemic problem here of a kind of racial hierarchy within the workforce, and this tendency, therefore, towards automation is creating more unemployment. It's taking a very racialized form, and really the revolutionary future is really with the Black outsiders who are being ejected from the labor process. And so we're seeing this rising unemployment. And so, that's where the action is going to be, if there's going to be any kind of revolutionary transformation. This is a turnaround from their earlier writings, all three of them, where they really thought that the American working class, because it was the most industrially advanced society in the world, it was the American working class that was going to be the new revolutionary class worldwide, based on a more sort of classic notion of who the revolutionary agency is. Upon his writing this, then C.L.R. James was like, this is not Marxist. You feel like jumped the shark here. I can't, like, you're wrong. And so then they have this break that then the Boggs go off on their own. And so, this has been narrated in different ways. People, it's complicated, but I'm really interested in this kind of thinking about what's this relation between Trotskyism and Maoism in this break and the framing of that? Because it's true that a lot of people do see the Boggs as, even though they're kind of older generation than a lot of the new leftists in the 60s, kind of anticipate a lot of the interests of what defined the new left rather than the old left, which is they see youth, women, people of color as like the new force, which is more of a new left thing than an old left thing. So they're an unusual kind of intergenerational set of activists who then were also incredible, just like senior advisors to these activists, like the Revolutionary Action Movement folks were like, gotta go to Detroit and sit down in the Boggs' living room and see what Grace thinks. Like, what? Really? That's crazy. So, you know, you can just like read these amazing stories.
Okay, couple of grad student questions before, or undergrad questions before we open up to everybody. Don't be afraid to ask what might seem like basic.
Oh, please do. Yeah, because I'm so confused. Any question will really help me focus.
Thank you so much. I think this might be a dumb question, but so I'll praise you guys. I guess my question is around what does like framing the revolutionary force as circle population do for movement, as opposed to framing it as like we are guerrillas or we are X or what is the framing of identifying oneself, and maybe the identification is itself also functional to some extent. Yeah. What do you think that does in terms of shifting the way that we think about revolution or practice or etc.?
Okay, so the relative surplus population is like a term that comes from Marx, from Capital chapter 25, but also elsewhere. And I think that, and obviously I'm going to give a partisan answer because I like Marx and I like Capital. And I like thinking, I think it's very useful to think of connecting, well, guerrilla warfare is like a strategy, right? It's a political strategy of how you fight. It's not an economic theory, right? Of like your position in relation to production or like what you're doing economically. Surplus population is a political economic term insofar as capital is a, let's just say, it gives us a political economy. It also gives us a critique of political economy. I'll set that aside for now. It's about politics and economics, not just economics, is I guess what I want to say. Surplus population, insofar as it's a political and economic category, grounds the idea that there will be these excluded peoples in society that stem from a process of continual automation or rising, increasing technological advancement and the desire for capital to keep investing in technology over labor. Marx's Capital explains why that is, that there is a continual desire to invest in technology over labor despite continual protests against that, even if it is not necessarily profitable for a company to do that or efficient. I can think of so many examples of companies like my own university saying we got to fire all those staffers and invest in new computers or new technology to mechanize the process or mechanize the checkout stand at supermarkets and fire labor. Like, why? It's like, is it really saving you money? Not necessarily. So Marx is very fascinated about this question. Why is this, there is this, so capital is a lot about that. Now, the ejection of labor from the process and increasingly technical labor, which is automation, dehumanizing as an AI, right? For Marx, there's an intrinsic contradiction in that, and that is that it is labor that produces surplus value. It's labor, it's that the extent to which you can exploit the labor that you can make money. The more you have to invest in machines, you don't necessarily make money. And in fact, that's what drives the small businesses out. They can't afford the big machines, right? So that's why there's a tendency towards monopoly capitalism, bigger and bigger, they swallow up the small. Okay, so sorry, this is long explanation. The result of the continual historical tendency towards ejection of labor from the total labor process globally, sometimes it means offshoring from one country to another. So then the more advanced a country is, the more automated it is, the fewer workers are employed in production, and then because you're finding cheap labor elsewhere, right? But eventually you run out of the cheap labor, as in general, automation happens everywhere. That's the logic. More and more unemployed people. it's pointing to the, like, I guess you could say, the extent of the unsustainability of the whole system. It's showing that there's a process that connects the US to China to Mexico, that people are connected, right? Exploitation here, unemployment here may mean employment somewhere else, but on terrible terms, right? And those things are connected. So I guess I like surplus population because it also is showing that there is this kind of like unsustainability to the whole system. What's unsustainable is the ejection of people from what Marx calls the means of production, a separation from their means of life. They're depend on a wage, so you need money to buy your food. You can't grow your food, you've been separated from your land, but then there's no money to be had because there's no jobs. The eating up of people and the eating up of nature. And so it's the exhaustion of life, basically. And so I find that a very powerful argument. Sorry, now I'm just like making a whole argument about capital, but I think that surplus population is a way to think about connectivity of like different groups of people who seem like they're in different geographies and in different occupations or different sectors. It also connects the employed and the unemployed so that our fates are also connected.
One more grad student question or undergrad question, if there is one. Or is that, oh, Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this. Just going off what you were just saying, after Michael's question, just sort of trying to resolve things in my own brain. So I'm going to just explain probably rather than ask a question, but I guess, so thinking about surplus, the surplus population is sort of one part in sort of bridging this gap between Maoism and Trotskyism, I think. That since Mao is thinking about the peasantry,
yeah,
and so it's in that case it's more about dispossession of land and going back to like primitive accumulation via Marx. So using these two Marxist concepts in order to like imagine a more like kind of global coalitional possibility that's just sort of like who is dispossessed, and now we can sort of like start from this baseline, since like difference is going to, there'll just be difference on and on and on, but this is sort of like one, that's sort of like the bit that can conjoin, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, no, I like that. One thing that's useful to point out is that the notion of surplus populations has different types. So like latent surplus population kind of refers to people who are like potentially going to be workers. So like peasants, for example, who will need to be dispossessed from the land and then converted into industrial workers. So like, you know, like moving people off their farms and then they have to go find work in the cities, right? And we see that happening with, you know, China in the 80s and 90s, and even maybe through the 2000s when China is kind of like the world's workshop. And so there's a dispossession, you have this kind of internal migration from the country to the city, when China is doing a lot of that export processing production. So that's like latent, like to be surplus, rendered into a surplus population. And then there's like stagnant, then there's like floating. Floating is like people who are occasionally employed. They don't have permanent employment. You could think of like seasonal migrant workers in the US. They're like floating surplus population. They're not like, you know, regularly employed, and capital also depends upon the existence of a floating surplus population, because you need a large pool of unemployed and potentially employed in order to keep wages down of the employed. And then there's stagnant, and those are people who are like homeless, like completely ejected, like completely beyond even like occasional employment. And capital always needs all three at all times. And they play a certain kind of role. But what's interesting is that like in the argument, the pool of regularly employed gets smaller and smaller as capital moves towards intensive contradiction. That's the theory.
Okay, we'll open up to the whole room.
Yeah, hand in the back.
Like everybody, thank you for the talk. It was very presented a lot of information. One of the things that I was curious about, since it did seem to be like a major theme, but like, you know, kind of amongst others, is how, given this turn or this shift towards within Maoism, thinking of revolution and revolutionary movements along the lines of relative surplus populations instead of like orthodox class categories.
Yeah.
How does that then connect to race overall, sort of the cultural, or kind of like as you see it, and maybe project like in our current conjecture, you know, kind of updated from with Boggses and Chang
Yeah.
writing?
Yeah. So I think the Boggs, and you know, this is not my original argument, the Boggs' American Revolution is like a key text that basically links Marx's notion of relative surplus population to the condition of the example of African Americans and what's happening to them in the by the early 60s and late 50s. And this is after, even during a period when US profitability and the economy was fairly still robust. It had not yet hit 1970s economic crisis. But what they were seeing was that Black people were not were being differentially affected by the problem of unemployment, and therefore they saw that there was a link between who was surplus population and Black people. And so they are, I think, the American Revolution is very important in linking the idea of racialization and surplus population. Prior to that, but you know, or not prior to that, I mean, I think there are people who work on the period prior to the 60s who often use the term segmented labor markets to also refer to racial stratification within the employment market, which explains why, you know, during the era of Jim Crow or during the era of Asian exclusionism, or even during the era now of that you have undocumented workers who then can be paid a lower wage because they're undocumented and they have no recourse to state laws regarding minimum wage, et cetera, means that race is used as a strategy for a differential wage system, right? So that would be referred to within the labor market. But I think what you get out of relative surplus population is a theory that's more global, that's not just like industry-based. It also connects to the question of how unemployment fits into the picture of, is related dynamically to employment, whereas the latent, right? So, and then also the international picture, which you get. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think, yeah, it's, you know, if you want to read more about this, Cedric Johnson, Jason Smith, or some people who have really like talked about this with the importance of James Boggs's The American Revolution. The one other thing I'll say is that in classical Marxian theory, surplus population often gets associated with, in particular, you know, and this is again subject to now some rethinking, whether the lumpen proletariat can actually be a revolutionary agent. And classically, the answer is no. The lumpen proletariat in Marx is like, by definition, the treacherous class, right? And Clyde Barrow has an interesting book on the dangerous classes, talking about the sort of revival of the lumpen proletariat, the theory of the lumpen proletariat from Marx to the Black Panthers. So Eldridge Cleaver, you know, has a whole lumpen proletariat theory based on that. You know, he didn't use the term surplus populations, but basically, you know, the people who the Panthers were tapping were the lumpen, and so in thinking of them as revolutionary agents, there's a whole shift from the proletariat to the lumpen, but that's more like a political identity, whereas relative surplus population, I would say, is more like an economic theory. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think the Black Panthers had a band called the Lumpen, right?
Sorry?
They had a musical band called the Lumpen. Could be wrong. But riffing on, first of all, this archaeology of this really important synthesis and revolutionary thought in this country that had to deal with race. Profound. And it's an important one. And it's still relevant. But I want to riff on the title, because the cultural move was really the racial move. But when we look at the cultural move, I want to see if you can share with us maybe Chang or the Boggs' theories on culture and revolution. You know, Lenin, Mao, and Trotsky were really permissive of raw cultural forms like the novel and stuff. Even as Maoism and Bolshevism went towards socialist realism, which is so overly didactic, nobody even paid attention because, that's one church. But I'm wondering if the Boggs have more vernacular, Black, vernacular, Asian American theory of art, or theory of Black revolutionary potential in certain forms and Asian American forms and this stuff that might have been the site of the demystification that they were engaged in.
Not that,
Did they include this in any of this writing to theorize?
I mean, the Boggs were interested in psychology and like subjective development. I'm trying to think of, I don't really think they write about aesthetics, or art forms, but or at least maybe I've been missing that. Could be my fault. Like I have been reading for that, but there's no explicit writing on art per se or cultural production. Similarly, Chang was very much like philosophical, theoretical. These are more like political theorists and philosophers, I would say. I am interested in the second part of the book. I've been like really steeped in the political theory, in trying to figure out how it's taken up in Asian American literature. And so starting from the 70s. And so I've been doing this writing around, Maxine Hong Kingston, some other art, and basically trying to reframe the more common sense view that Asian American literary production was basically divided between a kind of cultural nationalism of the IE project on the one hand, and then a kind of feminist literary aesthetic on the other that was more transnational, when in fact I think what's been missing is this whole sort of political background. And so I'm just trying to like set that narrative of literary history within this other frame of Marxist political theory, basically. Yeah, I'll just stop there for now. But other than to say that part of, just very quickly, part of what that requires is like a rereading of The One Warrior in terms of Maoism as well, like the Mulan figure, as in fact a Marxist guerrilla, which it was in the 70s. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take a couple questions. Diane, Chase, and
We also have a Zoom
question. Oh, Zoom. You want to take the Zoom questions first, and then Diane?
Okay, somebody asks, what's the distinction between race-based organizing and organizing with Blackness understood as a position of class struggle? And how do we historicize ourselves out of the racial fix?
Great question. Yeah. That is a historical question. That is a very contingent question. I think that one could say that the revolutionary conjuncture, the existence of the fact that we are in a revolutionary conjuncture or not, is tested by whether a race-based, what we mean by race-based, whether Black is a fixed term, and what does it mean for it to be fixed, and can racial ascription, can Blackness as understood as an ascribed racial category from above by the state, by the forces of differential proletarianization, by segmented labor markets, by willful discrimination on the part of individuals, by vigilante violence, all those things that make for racial ascription and the differential our differential access to life chances, whether there is movement to wrest that, to transvalue that, to act on the basis of that ascription, to change that into something that is emancipatory.
Diane.
I was just thinking you were thinking around Afro-Asia, so from this perspective. And I'm thinking about the different revolutionary tendencies within Asian American in the 70s in particular, right? And you're honing in on some of them, like Boggses and Chang and stuff. But and I'm wondering if you could share some of your thinking about the different tendencies with relationship to race, nationalism, right? Internationalism, Marx now, all this kind of stuff, right? Because there were such clear tensions. And then I'm also wondering if, as you're talking about surplus population, right, with the acceleration under neoliberalism in the present moment, the ways in which the study of the 60s and 70s, so fascinating, right, helps us think about revolutionary thinking and practice capacity in the present moment when so much has changed.
Yeah. In terms of different tendencies, to take the first question first, different tendencies within, do you mean within the New Communist movement, just the New Communist movement, or do you mean within the entirety of the late New Left?
Yes, the New Communist. We just stick to that.
So, okay, again, the New Communist movement are people who are considered to have been interested in Third World Marxist, Leninist figures, Che, Cabral, Mao, and then went back to Lenin as a result as well. There are different I mean, okay, so for people who are interested, Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air is really good, I think. It really gives a good picture of the different organizations. And why it's actually quite difficult to map this is because there were so many different groups, and they also fought a lot. And this is also the story of what happens to usually the division between the early New Left and the late New Left is understood to be about this shift as well. But so NCM are basically the people who identified as Marxists within a broader late New Left that were sort of progressive leftish, but not necessarily Marxist. They could be social democratic, they could be liberal, anti-war peaceniks. They could, yeah. Famously, the NCM is hard to figure out because of all that fighting. And let's just say, and this is partly get back to Ben's question about art. One picture of that would be Karente Yamashita's I Hotel, for example, which as a novel documents this movement to fight gentrification and the elimination of this hotel in San Francisco, Chinatown. That becomes the scene. That was a hotel that basically housed longtime Filipino and Chinese bachelors who were migrant workers, and it becomes the scene of a kind of squatters' occupation to prevent gentrification from happening. And so this is like a kind of site of activism for the Asian American and New Communist movement. And this is where but if you read that novel, you will see that a lot of the novel is also about how these groups all fought with each other. And that has to do with the fact that you have a lot of different kind of Maoisms. You have like a Filipino Maoism associated with the Philippine form of Maoism called the KDP. You have, even among Chinese Maoists, there was like a split between the Wei Min-she and the IWK, and they had different arguments about whether you do sort of unite around the working class and subordinate race, or whether you make the national question, bring that out into the foreground. So these were like intense doctrinal debates that then, which I think are actually important to reconstruct. I don't know how to answer your question, whether there was a more specific question behind the question about the different strains of the.
Yeah, but I don't want to take up too much time with that. I was thinking about the whole relationship, right, between race, class, nationalism, which is embedded in the kinds of
Yeah. No, I think I will say that. I think that. Oh, sorry. No. sorry, take time, yeah. No, I think I will say that, like, owing to, like, for example, the important work you've done to recover Richard Aoki as a Asian American member of the BPP, I think what happens from the standpoint of Asian American left history, it seems like the Red Guard learns about Maoism. The irony is that the Red Guard learn about Maoism from the BPP, right? It's the BPP who brings the Little Red Book to Alex Hing, and then Alex Hing is like, hey, I want to be more like Bobby Seale, and that will be so cool. And so the narrative that you get is like, you know, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton reading about Robert F. Williams in China and seeing a picture of him standing next to Mao, and they're like, wow, that's amazing. That brother is in China. We gotta like get with China. Mao's really cool. So they bring the Little Red Book to America, and then Asian American radicalism is like, we want to be like Black Americans who want to be like Mao. And so a lot of the history of Asian American radicalism specifically has been a kind of imitation Blackness, imitation Chineses, and trying to figure out how this is layered. And I think you see this kind of problem of mimicry inside the aesthetic representation of the Asian American 60s. And I guess I am interested in trying to think around that, or think a different route. Like what is the problem for what is the Asian American Marxist who's not a copy of a copy? What is the Asian American radical's relation to Asian Marxism, Asian Marxist awakening that is not routed through a desire to be Black like Mao, right? And how is there a kind of revolutionary agency back and forth, the kind of collaboration, something more intersubjective that is not a kind of imitation or a mimicry? I think there's something a little sad about that.
I think it's there, but I think it needs to be studied more, because I think it's too much studied through the mimicry of power, right? Revolution.
Yeah.
I really think if you go to the archives, right, it is there. And the whole racialization of Asian America meant that Asian Americans couldn't just copy Blacks, right? As Black people.
Right.
And
yes, no, I agree. And
well, you'll get to talk more at dinner. I just want to make sure that people will have a chance to ask more questions, if that's okay. But
sorry,
go ahead.
Love the question. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if other people want I have a different direction. I was in your aside about becoming more Hegelian, or you know, I'm thinking of that, and I'm also thinking of your earlier point that the Boggses and Chang have their sort of Hegelianism, right? And to me, one thing that could signal, I don't know if it is what you're signaling, but is that something like social relations, something like identity in some broad sense, right, is, I think, one of the passages sort of intersubjective or intracommunal rather than like international or outward facing in some sense, right? And another way of saying a lot of that is that, you know, what we end up thinking of or calling or referring to like the cultural turn or cultural studies, right, is in some sense like not as materially rooted as it might otherwise be understood. Right? Then when I think of the title, a value theory of the cultural turn, I hear that like we're actually going to be getting something different than that Hegelian, my understanding of all of that. So I guess my question is just sort of like one that I think we probably covered and I just didn't grasp, but like, does the value theory in the title mean to say there is a sort of different kind of understanding of identity or material source of identity that is somehow different than the thinkers you're working with? Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I think this is probably not a satisfactory answer because it's still hard to give a satisfactory answer right now. But I think by value theory, I would say like the shorthand is that is Marx, is Marx's capital. And I'm trying to basically say Marx and Mao meet up in a way that we don't understand yet. We don't have enough of an account of that because, and there are many, many, many ramifications of the way in which they don't meet up, which is critical theory is housed in this building, ethnic studies is housed in that building. Marxism is for white people and it's Western and European or whatever, and ethnic studies is for people of color and it's not theoretical and it's not really true political theory, you know, this kind of like antinomy that happens, right? So something is practice, something is theory, you know, there are all kinds of ramifications of this. And so I'm really trying to recover a history in which that's like actually not the case. And I see that in the theory and practice of, I'm trying to find the theory and practice of that, where this practice is a theory. And sometimes there's real reason why something can't appear as that. And there's sometimes it's because it really wasn't that. And like, it takes a long time to discern which it is. And so, yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but right now it's like, even within the story of Marxism itself, Marxist intellectual history, there's the history of Marxist-Leninism, and then there's the history of Frankfurt School theory and critical theory in Western Marxism, non-party Marxist theory that's very aesthetic, and even the recoveries of Italian Marxisms in the 70s and what are seen to be very exciting 70s forms of theoretical and practical Marxism are understood as like precisely because they're wildcatty. They're not party Marxisms, right? So it's really the 60s and 70s, the break with the idea that the party was producing theory that was alive, it was dead, right? That's why you're beating the orthodox Marxist dead horse over and over again. Yeah.
Is there anybody else? I can read it. So
There's one more Zoom question.
go ahead.
Okay, second Zoom question is, can Dr. Lye say a little more about Harry Chang's concept of race as analogous to money, and particularly how that would relate to the cycle of accumulation? Would then there be some kind of race prime?
Yeah, good. So right now I'm like steeped in his study notes for how he taught Capital Volume 3. So one quick hypothesis I'm going to throw out there is that the Boggs are Capital Volume 1 people, and that their theory of race comes from Capital Volume 1. And Chang, weirdly, is a Capital Volume 3 person, which is why he was really interested in the real appearance of value only as profit. And he didn't think the 70s there was capital crisis. And so it's closer to David Harvey's theory of the Grundrisse in terms of rate and mass balancing out ranges, because the general rate of profit is tending to fall doesn't mean that we're going to actually end up in a terminal crisis of capital because there's absolute masses growing. So the theory of race that we get from Chang is closer to something like the weird permanent way in which money is entirely abstract, in that it is based purely an exchange value and yet must have a body, which is why Marx was resting with the use value of money having a material body and needing to reside in gold or some kind of body that has a concrete use. And that's why it congeals in nature, and why class congeals in nature constantly reifies and congeals in a form of racial types. So there's something very productive about the way in which money takes on a life of its own. It becomes credit in the system that increasingly runs on credit and seems to be a zombie kind of capitalism, and race as a kind of reification that is it's a very real abstraction. And it's a different way of approaching it from people who approach race as real abstraction via Sohn-Rethel. So that's going to be my, very like inside baseball response.
Can I ask a question? So one of the things that you've pivotally helped us to think about is to move away from analogy to understand the unity of the capitalist production process as a kind of mode for understanding as a mode of understanding racial form as value form. And I think my question is just basically like, how does the Boggs' revolutionary humanism affect the way that they understand racism or racial ascription? So, if for them one cannot sort of see blackness as a epiphenomenal ascription, but as something that is perfected in and through revolutionary activity, and as something that is sort of like that we can only understand blackness as a kind of political blackness, right, as a category of the surplus population. There's also like a strand of their thought that was about the kind of like prolongation of the Cultural Revolution as a form, right, as an imagination that, especially in Revolution and Evolution, that book, one of the things that they imagine is a kind of perfection of the Cultural Revolution through a kind of constant creation of a new man through their understanding of revolutionary humanism. And I guess I don't have a particularly co-ed question, but I'm just wondering how that humanism affects the ways in which they read political blackness as a different way of thinking about race and racism. And then I think the connected question is also that the Black nation for both Chang and Boggs, just what does Black nationalism do for them that sort of like political blackness or a more general category of blackness or Black revolutionary thought does not, right? So the fact that the category of Black nationalism is what they're grappling with, but it's not a nation as a spatial category in the way that the decolonizing nations of the Afro-Asian moment were, but is a sort of Black imaginary community. Can you say a little bit about how imagining it as a Black nationalism as a site of revolutionary activity helps us think about what they're doing differently with race?
Well, Black nationalism in general, I think, was a term used beyond Boggs, right? Like in that period to interchangeably with Black power. I think that's important to say because, and this shows the extent to which I think the Marxist discussion of race liberation in the US was very much shaped by the adoption of the BNT, the Black Nation thesis by the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s as the basis for prioritizing anti-racist struggle, the ending of Black oppression as a communist purpose on the basis that Stalin had said that that nations have a right to self-determination, right? And in Stalin's case, he was speaking about ethnic minorities within what was the greater Soviet Union, what was the Soviet Union at the time, and so which ones had a certain right to a certain degree of autonomy that then fed into a notion of Soviet multiculturalism. There was a relative autonomy for these groups to have sovereignty. So to say that something has a nation, this is a post-World War I Versailles conference thing, to basically accord a group recognition as a nation is to accord them some kind of legal right to self-determination. So what weirdly, it's kind of like almost like retrofitting and saying like, oh, if you're a race, but if we call your race a nation, therefore that's a way to give you a legal status to be sovereign. And so I think that's how the analogy between race and nation creeps into a kind of US domestic language around Black liberation. So that, yeah, if that makes sense. But sovereignty can mean different things, right? Like, so it can mean, and so I think when you come to the late 60s, sorry, and when, famously, right, you get this disillusionment with like the civil rights movement after the assassination of Martin Luther King, or what happens with X, and this turn towards so-called Black power, not so-called Black power, then what it means to take power, it can mean, the BPP version is like you take local control. It may mean like carrying a gun. You have to take local control. You're giving up on like just a kind of like, pleading for civil rights, right? At a kind of electoral or legislative level. So I do think that, and so then, yeah, the question of the nation then becomes like, has a municipal form, I think, in many ways. And people have written about that as a kind of right to the city, right? I don't know, there was another part to the question. Yeah.
We can talk later.
Okay.
Thank you everybody so much for being here. Thank you, Colleen, for a fantastic talk.